From the very first day Amara stepped into the small town high school, she knew she didn't belong. It wasn't because she was different on the inside. She laughed, dreamed, and felt like anyone else. But because her skin, deep and radiant like polished mahogany, set her apart in a sea of pale faces. To her it was simply who she was. To them, it was something to mock. The laughter started small, almost playful, like the flick of a match before it became a flame. A comment about how dark she looked in photos. A whispered joke that echoed down the hallways. Then came the cruel nicknames: Shadow, Midnight, Burnt. They would laugh as she passed, nudging each other as if her pain was entertainment. At first, Amara tried to ignore it. Her mother had always told her that beauty wasn't measured by the shade of one's skin, but by the strength of one's heart. So, she held her head high, walking with quiet dignity even when her heart trembled inside. But in high school, kindness was weakness, and confidence was often mistaken for pride. The more she tried to rise above it, the harder they pushed her down. She began to shrink into herself. She stopped raising her hand in class. She avoided mirrors, hating the reflection that stared back. Makeup couldn't lighten her skin, no filter could change how the world saw her. She learned to hide her hurt behind silence. Even teachers, the people who were supposed to protect her, didn't always help. Some ignored the teasing altogether, pretending not to hear it. Others offered hollow words like, "Ignore them," or "They're just kids." But words like those didn't stop the humiliation. They only reminded Amara that no one truly understood. At lunch, she sat alone, tracing patterns into her tray just to avoid eye contact. The cafeteria was a battlefield. Laughter ricocheted from every corner. And though her tormentors didn't always speak directly to her, their whispers found her anyway. She'd catch fragments like, "She's too dark to be pretty," or "How can someone look like that?" And each word carved a deeper scar. Her saving grace was her mother, a woman of quiet resilience who worked long hours as a nurse but never came home without a smile. Their small apartment wasn't much: cracked walls, second-hand furniture, and a leaking roof. But it was a place filled with warmth. Her mother often told her stories about their ancestors, people who survived storms of prejudice and still stood tall. "Your skin," she would say, "is not a burden. It's a crown." But no matter how often Amara heard it, the world outside didn't agree. As years passed, the weight of the ridicule grew unbearable. She tried to blend in, wearing long sleeves to avoid sun exposure, applying light, toned powders that never matched her complexion, even using homemade remedies she found online that promised to brighten her skin. But nothing worked. The mirror always told the truth. She was still her, still too dark for their liking. And yet, deep down, something inside her refused to break completely. There was a spark, small but fierce, that refused to die out. It showed itself in art. Whenever the world became too cruel, Amara turned to painting. Her mother had saved for months to buy her first set of brushes and cheap acrylic paints. It became her escape. Through every stroke, she poured her pain, her dreams, and her defiance. Her canvases came alive with deep hues, bold blues, earthy browns, and fiery reds, colors that spoke of emotion and endurance. She painted women who looked like her, strong, beautiful, and unafraid. One day her art teacher, Mrs. Rowe, noticed her work. She encouraged Amara to submit a piece for the upcoming regional art competition. Amara hesitated at first. The thought of exposing her heart to the same world that ridiculed her felt terrifying. But something told her this was her moment to reclaim herself. She worked for days, sometimes through the night, on a painting that would later define her life. It was a portrait, not of anyone famous, but of herself. Yet it wasn't how others saw her. In her painting, Amara stood in a field of sunlight, her dark skin glowing like gold, her face calm and unbothered by the shadows around her. Behind her, figures whispered in darkness, faceless and insignificant. It was powerful, painful, beautiful. The day of the competition arrived, and the school auditorium buzzed with chatter. Students from all over the district displayed their artwork: bright landscapes, smiling portraits, and dreamlike abstractions. When Amara's painting was unveiled, the room fell silent. For a brief, haunting moment, everyone stared. Her bullies, her teachers, even the judges, all were transfixed. But admiration was quickly followed by mockery. She heard snickers from the back. Of course she painted herself. Someone whispered, "She just wants attention." Their words stung, but Amara didn't look away this time. She stood beside her painting, tall and proud, her hands trembling but her heart steady. When the results were announced, she didn't win. The ribbon went to a landscape painting of a mountain sunrise. The judges called it technically refined. Amara's piece, they said, was too emotional, too raw, too much. She left the hall quietly, clutching her canvas. The night was cold and the streets were nearly empty. For a moment she felt defeated, as if all her courage had been wasted. But when she passed by a glass window, she caught her reflection. The glow of streetlights shimmered against her skin, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not shame, not sorrow, but strength. She realized then that her worth didn't depend on their applause. Her darkness wasn't a curse. It was her light. Still, life didn't change overnight. The whispers didn't stop. The world didn't suddenly become kind. But that spark inside her began to grow again, burning hotter than ever before. She started sharing her art online, quietly, anonymously. Through a small social media page she created late one night. She posted her paintings one by one, each telling stories of beauty, struggle, and power in brown skin. She didn't expect much. But within weeks, messages began to pour in from people around the world who felt seen through her work. They wrote things like, "Thank you for painting me," and "Your art made me love my skin again." For the first time in her life, Amara felt something unfamiliar: acceptance. Not from her school, not from the town, but from the world beyond it. And just as her online following began to grow, just as her paintings started being shared by strangers and small art pages, an unexpected email arrived in her inbox. One that would change everything. It was from a woman claiming to represent a major international art exhibition. She said Amara's work had been discovered online and had moved the selection committee deeply. They wanted to feature her art at their annual show in New York City. Amara stared at the screen in disbelief, her hands trembling, tears welling in her eyes. The same world that had once laughed at her darkness was now calling it beautiful. But little did she know, her journey, and her reckoning with those who once mocked her, was only just beginning. The days that followed were heavy and endless for Aisha. Every time she walked through the school corridors, whispers trailed behind her like shadows. Laughter rippled across the hallways whenever she passed, and even when there was silence, she could feel the invisible judgment pressing down on her. Her dark skin, once something she never thought twice about, had become the center of attention. It wasn't admiration. It was mockery, disdain, rejection. The same classmates who once shared notes with her now turned their faces away. Some mimicked her accent, others called her names too cruel to repeat. They made her feel alien, like her very existence was something that didn't belong. And though she tried to ignore them, pretending their words meant nothing, they slowly began to sink deep into her heart, like tiny blades carving self-doubt into her once bright spirit. Teachers noticed the change. Aisha, who used to raise her hand eagerly in class, now kept her head down. The girl who loved art stopped drawing. The one who laughed freely now avoided eye contact. It wasn't just her peers. It was the system around her, too. Some teachers looked at her with pity, while others treated her as though she was destined for less. They assumed her silence meant disinterest, her quietness a lack of ability. No one saw the pain behind her calm eyes. At home, Aisha tried to keep up the facade. She told her parents everything was fine, that school was just stressful. She smiled through dinners, helped her younger sister with homework, and retreated to her room at night, where she cried quietly into her pillow, hiding her tears from the world. There, in the solitude of her small bedroom, she wondered if they were right. Maybe her skin really was something to be ashamed of. Maybe she wasn't beautiful enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to fit in. Weeks turned into months, and the bullying didn't stop. It evolved. Online, her classmates made memes of her picture from a school event, comparing her skin to dark objects, mocking her smile, her heritage, her clothes. She stopped posting pictures altogether. Social media, once a source of fun, became another battlefield she couldn't escape. But amidst the cruelty, there were small moments of strength. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the mirror, she remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell her. Stories of powerful women from their homeland, women with skin as dark and radiant as hers who led, fought, and created change. She remembered her mother's words about beauty being more than skin, and how true strength isn't shown in moments of joy, but in moments of trial. Those memories became her quiet armor, fragile but real. Still, the world around her didn't make it easy. When the school announced the annual talent showcase, Aisha hesitated to join. Art had always been her passion, but she feared standing on that stage again. Feared the laughter, the whispers, the humiliation. But one afternoon, while cleaning her room, she found an old sketchbook buried under a pile of textbooks. Inside were drawings of her grandmother, her village, sunsets over the desert, scenes filled with love, pride, and identity. Something stirred inside her, a voice that whispered softly, that maybe, just maybe, she could turn her pain into power. That night she picked up her pencil again. It felt awkward at first, foreign almost. Her hands trembled, her heart doubted, but she kept drawing. Night after night, she poured everything she felt, the sadness, the anger, the shame, the resilience, onto the pages. Her art transformed into a language of emotion, each stroke telling a story she couldn't say aloud. She created portraits of women who looked like her, faces full of dignity and strength, surrounded by colors that glowed with pride. The art showcase came closer, and despite her fear, she decided to submit her work anonymously. She didn't care for credit, she just wanted her art to speak. She submitted a painting titled, Roots of Light. It was a self-portrait. Not of the broken girl she felt she had become, but of the woman she hoped to grow into. One who stood tall despite the darkness surrounding her, her dark skin shimmering under a crown of golden light. The day of the exhibition arrived. The school gym buzzed with chatter and excitement. Paintings, photos, and sculptures lined the walls. Her classmates crowded around their friends' projects, cheering and laughing. Aisha stood quietly in the back, her heart racing, her palms sweating. She told no one that one of the paintings belonged to her. When the judges began their tour, something unexpected happened. As they reached her painting, the room grew still. The bold colors and emotional depth drew everyone's attention. Whispers spread through the crowd, not of mockery this time, but awe. Students who had laughed at her were speechless. Teachers stared, trying to guess who could have created something so powerful. When the results were announced, her painting took first place. Her name was read aloud, and for a moment, the entire room fell silent. She could feel their eyes on her. The same eyes that once looked down on her now looking at her differently. Not with mockery, but with recognition. It wasn't victory she felt. It wasn't pride. It was relief, the relief of being seen, of reclaiming the space she had once been pushed out of. But deep down, she also knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The whispers started again, not of laughter, but confusion. Some were angry, unwilling to accept her success. Others were inspired, yet through it all, Aisha stayed calm. Her art had spoken louder than any insult ever could. But as the applause faded that evening, she noticed something unexpected. The same girls who had bullied her the most were glaring at her from across the hall. Their faces burned with jealousy and disbelief. And as Aisha walked home that night, holding her ribbon in one hand and her sketchbook in the other, she felt the chill of something else. Not fear, but the awareness that the world around her was about to change in ways she could not yet see. Because she had not just painted a picture. She had started a fire. The laughter that once echoed in the school hallways still haunted Aisha in her quietest moments. It wasn't the sound itself that hurt. It was the memory of faces behind it. Faces that looked at her as though she were less, as though her dark skin was something to be mocked, not marveled at. But what those faces never saw was the spark their cruelty ignited within her. A fire that would one day light her path to greatness. In the years that followed her graduation, Aisha buried her pain under layers of ambition. She had always loved art, sketching faces, colors, light, and texture. But during those dark teenage years, art had become her escape, her refuge. While the world mocked her for her complexion, she learned to create beauty through it. Every stroke of her pencil, every shade of color she blended on canvas became a defiance, a statement that she would define her worth on her own terms. After high school, she applied to the local arts college. It wasn't prestigious, but it was the only one she could afford. Her parents worked tirelessly to support her dreams, though they feared the path she chose might lead to disappointment. The art world, after all, wasn't known for embracing people who looked like her, especially women with dark skin. Aisha knew this better than anyone. From the moment she stepped into the art department, she felt the same invisible wall that had followed her through childhood. Her classmates were polite, but distant. Professors praised her technical skill but rarely encouraged her vision. When she painted dark-skinned models, she noticed the subtle discomfort on their faces. A quiet, unspoken judgment that her art didn't fit the traditional standards of beauty. But Aisha refused to stop. In every piece she painted, she celebrated the deep richness of melanin, the glow of dark skin under sunlight, the resilience behind tired eyes, the power of black identity in a world that often erased it. Her art became not just her passion, but her rebellion. Months turned into years, and Aisha's work began attracting attention. A local gallery owner stumbled upon one of her paintings during a student exhibition, a portrait of a woman whose ebony skin gleamed with unapologetic grace. It was bold, raw, and emotional. He offered to feature it in a small community showcase. That single opportunity became her first step into the world beyond her small circle. The painting drew murmurs from visitors. Some were captivated, others uncomfortable, but no one could ignore it. That was all Aisha needed. Still, success did not come easily. The art world was ruthless, and every small victory was followed by long stretches of rejection. She sent dozens of applications to galleries and competitions, only to receive silence in return. There were times when she sat in her dimly lit apartment, surrounded by unfinished canvases, wondering if the world would ever truly see her the way she saw herself. Yet, every time despair threatened to consume her, she remembered her younger self, the girl who walked the school hallways, her head held high despite the laughter behind her. That memory didn't hurt anymore, it fueled her. Then came the email that changed everything. An international art contest based in New York. The Voices of the Unseen exhibition was looking for artists who could redefine identity and representation. Aisha submitted a portfolio of her most powerful works, not expecting much. Weeks passed, silence. Then one evening, as she checked her inbox with wary eyes, she saw the message that would alter her destiny. Congratulations. You've been selected as a finalist. Aisha stared at the screen in disbelief. Her heart pounded. It wasn't just about the recognition. It was about being seen. Truly seen. The days leading up to the exhibition were a blur. She worked tirelessly, creating new pieces that spoke from the deepest corners of her soul. Each one told a story, of rejection, of beauty, of survival. The centerpiece was a massive portrait she titled Unbreakable. It depicted a dark-skinned woman standing amidst a storm, her head wrapped in a golden scarf, her eyes fierce and unyielding. It was in many ways a reflection of herself. When she arrived in New York, the sheer scale of the city overwhelmed her. Towering buildings, flashing lights, and people of every color and creed filled the streets. But amid the chaos, Aisha felt strangely at peace. For the first time, she wasn't the girl being stared at. She was the artist being invited. The exhibition opening was a night she would never forget. Her paintings hung alongside works by artists from across the globe. Critics, journalists, and art lovers crowded the hall, murmuring in admiration and curiosity. Some stopped in front of her pieces, their expressions shifting from intrigue to awe. A few even asked to meet her. But the moment that etched itself forever into her memory came near the end of the evening. A well-known art critic, someone whose reviews could make or break careers, stood before Unbreakable. After several long moments, he turned to the curator and asked about the artist behind it. When Aisha was introduced, he shook her hand and simply said, This is what art should be." It was validation, not just for her talent, but for her truth. Within weeks, her name began circulating in the art community. Magazines featured her story. Galleries reached out with offers. Her social media following grew, filled with people who saw themselves in her work. Messages poured in from girls across the world, dark-skinned, brown-skinned, every shade in between, thanking her for showing them that beauty didn't need to be light to be powerful. Yet amid her newfound recognition, Aisha remained grounded. She knew that fame could fade, but purpose lasted. She continued to paint, not for approval, but for impact. Every brushstroke was a declaration that the skin once mocked, once laughed at, was a masterpiece of its own. But as her fame grew, so did curiosity about her past. Interviews began touching on her experiences with discrimination. Reporters wanted to know, who were the people that made her feel lesser? Did she ever forgive them? Aisha always answered with grace. But deep down, she wondered if the world would ever circle back, if those who once mocked her would ever realize how wrong they had been. That moment would come sooner than she imagined, because somewhere in her hometown, a reunion was being planned, a gathering of the very people who had once called her names, who had laughed at her skin. They had no idea who she had become, no idea that the girl they mocked was now a name the world celebrated. and when Aisha received the invitation in the mail, her heart skipped a beat. Fate, it seemed, was giving her a chance to return, not for revenge, but for revelation. As Amara stepped into the bustling city of New York, it felt as though the air itself carried dreams. The streets buzzed with ambition, artists painting on corners, musicians strumming under subway lights, and models rushing between casting calls with nervous smiles. To many, it was a city of opportunity, but for Amara, it was also a battlefield, a place where she would have to prove her worth all over again. She had left her small hometown behind, leaving years of mockery and whispered insults buried in its dusty roads. But even as the skyline welcomed her with open arms, she could not forget the laughter, the cruel giggles of classmates calling her too dark, the hushed tones of adults saying she'd never make it on TV. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw not just her reflection, but the echoes of that rejection. Yet now those same echoes fueled her determination. The modeling agency that had accepted her application was small but reputable. It prided itself on diversity, but Amara soon realized that even in a place that spoke of inclusion, colorism ran deep. During her first portfolio shoot, the makeup artist sighed dramatically, muttering that her skin tone was hard to work with. The photographer adjusted the lights, saying they couldn't find the right exposure. The other models, with their fair skin and sharp features, smiled politely but avoided her gaze. As if she didn't belong in their frame, Amara stood still through it all. She had learned that silence was its own form of power. Every glare, every slight, became another brick in the fortress she was building within herself. She would not beg for acceptance. She would earn it through undeniable success. Her early gigs were modest, local magazines, small campaigns, and background roles in commercials. But she gave every job her heart. Her photos carried emotion, depth, and quiet defiance. She refused to let the camera flatten her story. The world might have wanted her to dim her light, but she had learned that her skin, deep, rich, radiant, was not her weakness. It was her armor. Months passed. The competition was fierce. Many nights, she returned to her tiny apartment exhausted and on the verge of giving up. The modeling world was brutal, especially for women who didn't fit its narrow beauty standards. But just as her resolve began to falter, fate intervened. One afternoon, an international fashion house announced an open casting call for their upcoming campaign, a campaign focused on real beauty. It sounded like a dream, yet most models rolled their eyes, knowing that real beauty rarely meant dark skin. But Amara went anyway. She had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The line outside the casting building stretched down the block. Models from around the world waited nervously, clutching their portfolios. When Amara's turn finally came, the panel of judges barely looked up. Their expressions were polite but uninterested, until she stepped under the studio lights. For the first time, something shifted. Her skin glowed under the lens, her posture unwavering, her eyes steady and fierce. The photographer clicked once, then again. Slowly, the panel leaned forward. They whispered to each other as she posed, not with practiced smiles, but with quiet dignity, the kind born from years of fighting invisibility. Days turned into weeks. She assumed she hadn't been chosen. Then one morning, her phone buzzed with an email. She had been selected, not just as a model for the campaign, but as its face. The photo shoot was unlike any other. The theme was Shades of Strength. Models from all backgrounds were chosen, but Amara's presence commanded attention. The creative director praised her for her natural power, her authenticity, her elegance that needed no embellishment. For the first time in her career, she felt seen, truly seen. When the campaign launched, it exploded across social media. Billboards in Times Square, fashion magazines, digital ads, everywhere, her image stood tall and proud. The girl once mocked for being too dark was now the symbol of empowerment for thousands. Messages flooded her inbox. Young girls from around the world thanked her for showing them that beauty was not confined to fairness. Influencers, journalists, and even celebrities shared her story, calling her a revolution in representation. But the most shocking messages came from her hometown, from people who had once laughed at her. Some apologized. Others claimed they'd always knew she'd make it. Yet, amid all the fame and attention, Amara remained humble. She knew this was only the beginning. Her success wasn't just about fashion. It was about reclaiming her identity and reshaping what society deemed beautiful. But even as her fame grew, not everyone celebrated her rise. There were whispers, people saying she was overhyped, playing the victim card, or just lucky. Some in the industry couldn't accept that a dark-skinned woman was commanding such influence. Then came the invitation that would change everything again. A global humanitarian organization reached out, asking her to be the face of their upcoming campaign against colorism, to speak out, to share her story on international platforms. They wanted her voice to represent millions who had been silenced by shame and prejudice. It was an honor, but also a heavy responsibility. She knew that speaking up meant facing backlash, but she also knew she couldn't remain silent anymore. The same voice that had been ridiculed for years now had the power to spark change. As she stared at the contract in her hands, the city lights twinkled outside her window. She thought of her younger self, the girl hiding from mirrors, the one afraid to step into sunlight. Now, the world was watching her. And yet, deep down, she felt something stirring, a storm she hadn't anticipated. The higher she rose, the more resistance she faced. The next chapter of her life wouldn't be about being seen. It would be about being heard, and standing firm when the world tried to silence her once more. Amara's rise to fame had been like watching the dawn break after a lifetime of darkness. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. Her image shone on billboards, magazine covers, and digital campaigns across continents. She had become a voice for a generation, a living embodiment of resilience, grace, and defiance. Yet, as her star rose higher, so did the shadows that followed her. The invitation from the humanitarian organization had been a turning point. They wanted her to be the global ambassador for their campaign. Color is not a curse. The initiative aimed to confront the centuries-old stigma surrounding dark skin, to challenge the media, and to empower young people who had been made to feel lesser. It was everything Amara had dreamed of, a chance to use her success for something greater. But with influence came scrutiny. The moment her first speech went viral, the backlash began. The same internet that had once crowned her an icon now turned against her. Trolls filled her comment sections with insults, accusing her of making everything about race. Some said she was ungrateful. Others mocked her for playing the victim. Even within the fashion industry, whispers grew louder. Some brands distanced themselves, fearful of controversy. Others suggested she tone down her activism, warning that she was alienating her audience. Still, Amara refused to retreat. She remembered the young girl she used to be, the one who had hidden from the mirror. For that girl, and for every child who had ever been shamed for their skin, she chose to keep speaking. She spoke at universities, fashion events, and televised panels, each time sharing her story with raw honesty. Every time she stood before a crowd, she carried the weight of generations on her shoulders. Behind the cameras, however, the cost of courage became heavier. Her schedule was relentless, her inbox filled with threats and hate messages. Some of her closest friends began to drift away, uncomfortable with her growing fame and the intensity of her mission. Her agent warned her that she was being too political, that her career might crumble if she kept pushing boundaries. But Amara's heart had changed. Once, she had dreamed of walking runways. Now, she dreamed of rewriting what those runways represented. The cause had become bigger than her career. It had become her purpose. Months passed, and the campaign began to gain momentum. Her face became synonymous with empowerment. She was invited to speak at a global conference in London, her biggest platform yet. The event promised to unite world leaders, activists, and artists to discuss diversity in media. It was a moment of validation, the kind that seemed to erase years of struggle. But life had a way of testing resolve just when one thought they had reached safety. A week before the event, a scandal erupted. An anonymous post on social media accused Amara of hypocrisy, claiming she had undergone skin lightening treatments early in her career. The accusation was false, a cruel fabrication, but it spread like wildfire. Old photos taken under poor lighting were twisted into proof. Overnight, her integrity was questioned. News outlets picked it up, gossip sites magnified it, and online commentators dissected her appearance. Some who had once celebrated her turned their backs. The campaign sponsors grew nervous, and the humanitarian organization called an emergency meeting to review her participation in the upcoming conference. Amara was shattered. After everything she had endured, the same society that had mocked her skin now accused her of trying to change it. The irony was unbearable. She felt betrayed, not just by the media, but by a world that seemed incapable of seeing her truth. For days, she withdrew from public life. The once vibrant light in her eyes dimmed. Her apartment, once filled with flowers and congratulatory letters, now felt like a cage. She questioned everything, her strength, her purpose, even her worth. But as she scrolled through her messages late one night, something caught her attention. Buried among the hate were letters from young women around the world, from Nigeria, India, the Caribbean, and even small towns in America. They shared their stories of being bullied, rejected, and ashamed of their skin, but also how Amara had inspired them to embrace who they were. Tears welled in her eyes as she read each one. She realized that her struggle was no longer her own. Her pain had become a mirror for others, and if she let herself be silenced, she would be betraying not just herself, but every person she had inspired. The next morning she rose before dawn. For the first time in weeks, she looked at her reflection in the mirror and smiled faintly. Her skin, glowing softly in the early light, told the story of endurance. It was not perfect, not polished, but it was hers, and it was powerful. She called the organization and confirmed her attendance at the conference. Her team warned her that the media storm would be unforgiving, but she didn't care. She had faced worse before. The cruel laughter of childhood, the silent judgment of peers, the systemic prejudice of an industry built on exclusion. This was just another test. When the day of the conference arrived, the hall was filled with journalists, photographers, and prominent figures. The air was tense, anticipation heavy. Everyone wondered if Amara would address the controversy. As she walked to the stage, the crowd fell silent. Her presence was calm, commanding, and unshakable. She began to speak. Not to defend herself, but to redefine the conversation. She talked about the power of self-acceptance, about how society had taught people to see darkness as something to fix instead of something to celebrate. She spoke about the cruelty of a system that built beauty on exclusion, and the courage it took to exist outside that mold. Her voice, steady and soulful, echoed through the auditorium. People who had come expecting scandal found themselves moved instead. By the end of her speech, the audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. It was not pity nor admiration, it was respect. Her words spread across social media like wildfire, reclaiming the narrative. Major outlets that had criticized her now praised her resilience. The false accusations faded, drowned by the sound of her truth. But as Amara returned backstage, catching her breath, a quiet realization settled over her. This fight was far from over. She had won a battle, yes, but the war against prejudice, colorism, and ignorance still raged beyond those walls. And somewhere in the shadows, forces threatened to pull her down once again. Envious competitors, bitter critics, and powerful voices that felt threatened by her rise. Amara knew what awaited her next, not comfort, but confrontation. She had stepped into the light, and now she had to protect it. The conference had ended with thunderous applause, yet for Amara, it was more than a professional triumph. It was the reclaiming of her identity. Her words had cut through years of stereotypes and silence, piercing through the armor of prejudice that had long defined how people saw her. But after the lights dimmed and the cameras stopped flashing, the real transformation began, not just in her life, but in the world around her. In the weeks that followed, Amara's speech traveled across continents. It was translated, quoted, and shared by millions. Schools began using it in diversity programs. Fashion houses that once ignored darker models issued public pledges to change their standards, and young women everywhere started using her words as mantras. Her message had become a movement. Yet amid all the praise and newfound attention, Amara remained grounded. She remembered the girl who once hid behind classroom doors, hoping no one would notice her. She remembered the sting of cruel laughter, the quiet rejection, the humiliation of being told she wasn't pretty enough. Those memories, though painful, had become her greatest teachers. They had shaped her into someone the world could no longer overlook. As her influence grew, Amara received an invitation that left her breathless. A personal message from the United Nations, inviting her to deliver a keynote address at their annual Global Summit on Equality. The theme was Breaking the Chains of Colorism. It would be broadcast to millions, a global stage unlike any she had ever imagined. The irony was not lost on her. Once, she couldn't even get a seat at the table. Now, she was being asked to lead it. When the day came, the hall was filled with world leaders, activists, and icons. As Amara stood backstage, waiting for her name to be called, she felt the same flutter of anxiety she had felt as a young girl walking into her first school talent show. The same trembling she'd felt the first time she dared to step into the spotlight. But this time, she was not stepping forward as a frightened girl. She was stepping forward as a woman who had faced the world's cruelty and turned it into strength. The crowd rose in applause as she walked onto the stage. The vast hall shimmered with lights, but none brighter than the confidence radiating from her. When she began to speak, her voice was calm, resonant, and filled with conviction. She spoke of the quiet wars fought in mirrors, of the scars left by cruel words, and of the beauty in every shade of humanity. Her story was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told they were too dark, too different, or not enough. As she finished, the room fell into a reverent silence before erupting into applause that felt like a roar. People stood, not just to celebrate her, but to celebrate the message she carried. Cameras captured her tearful smile, a single image that would soon circle the globe. A dark-skinned woman standing at the center of the world's most powerful stage, no longer an outcast, but a symbol of pride. That image would become iconic. Over the following months, Amara's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. She launched a foundation to support young girls facing discrimination and built scholarships for those denied opportunities because of their appearance. She partnered with filmmakers to produce documentaries on colorism, ensuring that the conversation didn't fade when the headlines did. But what moved her most were the letters. Thousands of them, arriving from every corner of the world. They came from mothers, fathers, children, and even former bullies who had seen her story and felt compelled to reflect. One letter, however, struck her deeper than any other. It was from someone she hadn't thought about in years. A classmate from her school days, one of the girls who used to mock her. The letter was handwritten, filled with remorse. The woman admitted that back then, she hadn't understood the cruelty of her actions. Society had taught her that lighter was better, and she had followed that lie without question. But seeing Amara's rise had changed her perspective. She ended her letter with a single sentence that brought tears to Amara's eyes. "You taught me to love what I once mocked." It was in that moment that Amara realized something profound. Revenge was never her goal. What she had found was something far greater: redemption, not only for herself, but for those who had once hurt her. 1 year later, Amara returned to her hometown for the first time in over a decade. The local community center had been renovated and renamed the Amara Foundation for Empowerment. As she walked through its doors, she was greeted by a crowd of young faces, all different shades of brown and black, their eyes shining with admiration. She saw herself reflected in each of them. The dreams, the fears, the quiet yearning to be seen. She spoke to them that day not as a celebrity, but as a sister, a guide, a survivor. She told them that beauty was not something granted by others. It was something claimed from within. As she looked around, her gaze fell on a framed photograph hanging near the entrance. It was a picture of her standing at the UN podium, smiling through tears. Beneath it, a quote was engraved: "They laughed at my dark skin, but the world applauded me." The simplicity of the words captured everything. The journey from mockery to mastery, from pain to power. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amara stood outside the center, watching the children play under the fading light. The laughter that once haunted her now filled her with peace. It was laughter free of cruelty, filled with joy. The sound of a new generation growing up unafraid of their reflection. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the ridicule, the tears, the lonely nights, the fierce determination to rise above it all. Every wound had become a lesson. Every insult had become fuel. And now, standing beneath the vast sky, she realized that the very thing people had used to try to diminish her had become her crown. Her dark skin shimmered under the twilight, radiant, unapologetic, and victorious. The world had once told her she didn't belong in the light. Now, she was the light,